MacroWatch is producing a series of videos that explains everything necessary to understand how the economy works in the 21st century, in contrast to the way it worked before 1968, when dollars were backed by gold. The series is called Creditism 101. This video, the fifth in the series, shows that when the United States stopped backing dollars with gold, that change enabled the U.S. government to borrow on a scale that was enormous compared with the amounts it had borrowed before 1968. Over the past half-century, the government's power to spend seemingly limitless amounts of money has allowed the government to direct the economy at the macroeconomic level. More than that, it has shaped the course of history. This explosion of government spending has played a leading role in the evolution of capitalism into creditism, as well as being one of the most striking pieces of evidence that a transformation of our economic system has occurred. This video will focus on 8 consecutive periods between 1914, when the Federal Reserve began operations, and 2023 to illustrate the magnitude of the change that occurred after 1968. These are the same 8 periods used in the previous video, money creation since 1914. The first period covers 1914 to 1920, the years immediately before and after the United States involvement in World War I. During this period, the annual increase in government debt peaked in 1919 at $13 billion. Government debt rose from $1 billion in 1914 to $24 billion in 1920. The Fed's holdings of Treasury Securities increased from $200,000 in 1914 to $287 million in 1920. This chart shows that the Fed's ownership of Treasury Securities increased from near 0% of the total in 1914 to 4% of the Treasury Securities outstanding in 1917. By 1920, the Fed's ownership share was back down to 1%. Now, 1920 to 1930, after the war. This chart shows that government debt contracted every year from 1920 to 1930. Total government debt outstanding fell from $24 billion in 1920 to $16 billion in 1930. Between 1920 and 1930, the Fed's holdings of Treasury Securities increased from $287 million to $686 million. The Fed's ownership of Treasury Securities increased from 1% of the total in 1920 to 4% in 1930. Now, 1930 to 1941, the Great Depression. Government debt increased every year during the Great Depression, with the largest annual increase occurring in 1940 at $10 billion. The increase in government debt was largely due to the collapse of government revenues, since the economy shrank by 45% between 1929 and 1933. Government debt outstanding increased from $16 billion in 1930 to $57 billion in 1941. Between 1930 and 1941, the Fed's holdings of Treasury Securities increased from $686 million to $2.3 billion, with the largest increase occurring between 1931, when they were $775 million, and 1933, by which time they'd grown to $2.4 billion. The Fed's ownership share of Treasury Securities jumped from 4% in 1930 to as high as 11% in 1933, before moving back down to 4% in 1941.